Yesterday we finished with the presentation of this very detailed experimental program of what we call material number 1. And today I will go briefly, I will not explain in details, but I will go briefly to present additional experimental results from other material systems that we tested here in my group during the last 15 years. To show the similarities, first of all, and also the differences between the different material systems against fatigue loading. And I will start with the results. You see here the references are exactly the paper that I presented a few minutes ago, a few seconds even ago. So this results to a material which is a non-ply laminate with plus minus 45 degrees layers. We did quasi-static and fatigue experiments, constant amplitude fatigue, and here we focused on the interrupted fatigue at 0 and maximum load. Probably you remember yesterday we discussed about this effect of the interruption at 0 stress levels that was causing relaxation of the material, so it was very much beneficial for the fatigue life. And we did only, in this previous experimental program, we did only one stress level, and we tried to correlate the interrupted fatigue results to the continuous fatigue results. Here we repeated this for a complete SN curve with a different material, and we added the interruptions at maximum load. Again, discussing about the experiment and why we did these tests and not others. It was because we had a specific objective, and in this case, the objective was to investigate the failure modes, of course, of the plus minus 45 degrees laminates that are, by the way, very common in engineering applications, and to investigate the creep fatigue interaction. Here I could add creep fatigue relaxation effects, and all this was in a concept of developing at the end modeling procedures to simulate this behavior, and if possible also to predict behavior with based on these experimental results. I'll jump directly to the description of the experimental program. So what we did, as mentioned, we did continuous fatigue until the end. Then we did interrupted fatigue loading at high, during the interruption, keeping a high stress, which was exactly the same as the maximum stress of the cyclic loading. There we kept two different interruption times to simulate creep, 2 hours or 2 days. And we also did interrupted fatigue while during the testing, we were interrupting the fatigue, so the continuous amplitude fatigue loading, and going down to 0, so unloading the specimen completely. In all these cases, as we mentioned, we kept the specimen in the machine. We did not remove the specimen to avoid what we discussed also yesterday, the effect of the gripping pressure, the alignment of the specimen, and so on. So we then studied the mechanisms developed under the different loading patterns to be able also to be able to correlate the observed phenomena to the, let's say, physics of the failure. So the material that was used, it was a glass epoxy laminate with plus minus 45 layup. We fabricated everything in our lab with a vacuum-assisted hand layup technique. I suppose you are familiar with this method, where we stack the plies in the orientation that we would like. We apply by hand the resin, and then we put everything in a vacuum to make the production more consistent. So from these laminates that we manufacture, we cut specimens according to ASTM D3039. which defines these rectangular specimens with the tabs at the ends. And then we used some techniques for the measurement of the strain with a video extensometer. So video extensometer is similar to what you know today, DIC, but it only measures specific points. It does not give full field measurements, but it's more. I would correlate it more. I would say that it resembles more a clip gauge. You have 2 points, and then you measure with the photos. You measure the distance of these 2 points, the relative distance of these 2 points or 2 lines that you have in this case. Why we did this? You see in this photo, we say measurement 1, measurement 2, and measurement 3. The reason was that we wanted to have, first of all, the overall strain of the specimen, but also we wanted to have the local strains of the specimen, be able to correlate this to the damage that was observed. So fatigue testing, we'll just open this one. So fatigue testing was as usual in the chamber to keep the temperature low. We were also measuring, if you see here, we have a thermal camera monitoring the temperature of the specimen. We had this camera, video extensometer camera, to take photos of the specimen and be able to extract at the end the strains. And we also have a light source to improve. The lighting is necessary to improve the performance of the photography. So the results of the continuous loading is a typical lesson curve. You see again, if we start discussing about the scatter is typical of composites. It's a bit higher at high stress levels. It's a bit lower at low stress levels. And this is also okay in terms of even for the explanation, because at the high stress levels, the material is failing due to what we've seen also in the literature, the weak element. You have very high loads, and if the material is weak somehow, somewhere, it starts failing without notice. When you are at lower stress levels, you have damage that is distributed on the material, and it's not really affected by this what we call the weak element. So in this same experimental program, because we wanted to investigate the viscoelastic performance of the material, we recorded the fatigue loops, hysteresis loops, the area. How you do this? You have to record a lot of data, because then to draw a cycle like that, this is the stress and strain relationship actually per cycle. So imagine when you do, if I go back here, when you do this experimental program, the simple recording of data when you need to do a simple lesson curve is to record the maximum stress and record the number of cycles to failure. Only two points, only 2 data points. If you need to have also the high hysteresis loop area, you need to record every cycle, and you need to record a lot of points in any cycle, more than 10, 15, 20 probably points of. So you need the stress, you need the strain, and the number of cycles. And if you have this, then you can use these data points. Coming back here, you can use these data points to plot these cycles with 20, 30, depending on the accuracy that you want of these data points. So you see already the complexity of data handling. Here is again the question about the capacity of the machine, as Professor Bedi mentioned before, the capacity of the recording device to record so fast data, the capacity of your camera, this video extensometer camera, the frequency of photos that this camera can take, so that it gives you directly the measurement of the strain, and another point that is very significant here. You see that we use different equipment for different measurements, and at the end we want to put them all together and draw curves. So there, what is very, very significant, and we've seen in the past that it was causing a lot of problems, is the synchronization of all these measuring devices. If you measure load with the machine and then you measure your strain with the video extensometer camera, and they're not synchronized, and the camera gives you a strain value that does not correspond to the stress at the same time interval, then all the results will be falsified. So all these parameters are those that have to be confirmed during preliminary experimental programs before even going into the full experimental campaign. So here are the first results, and if we see I will open all this here for the fatigue performance. We've seen that, again, validating more or less the observations that we had for the previous material, the stiffness degradation that we see here with the number of cycles to failure shows again a trend that is usual for composites, this sigmoid trend with a significant increase in the beginning at around up to 10% of the life, a kind of constant slope for the majority of the loading, and then at the end a drop signifying the failure of the material. And we've seen also that the stiffness degradation was less, and this is what I write here, higher with sigma max, was less for higher stress levels. The same was happening for the high hysteresis area. High hysteresis area actually is the area that is enclosed in these loops. And this high hysteresis area signifies the energy that is lost during a fatigue cycle. So the more wide, the more fat a cycle is, shows that the more energy we lose. So you can imagine that for materials that are heating a lot, these loops are wider than others for materials that are not heating a lot. We didn't talk a lot about this in the past because in composites industry science, mainly people were investigating carbon composites and also unidirectional carbon composites that they do not hit, so they do not show significant high hysteresis areas. So for carbon composites, in this sense, you can expect to have cycles like this that are flat, very flat, without significant areas. And one interesting measurement that you can do also with this type of experiments is the evolution of the average strain. So average strain is actually, if you remember the test that we did was a sinusoidal load like that. And here is the test that we do is load control. Load control means that we keep the stress constant, the maximum and the minimum, and this ratio, minimum over maximum, defines the R ratio. But then for this material, the strain, if we plot the strain with cycles, it is not constant. The strain with cycles follows, we'll see if I can draw it correctly here, follow this trend. It goes higher because we have damage to the material, but also, so the minimum follows, and there is the average strain that is also increasing. And this is what we call the drifting of the cycle. So the average strain, if you imagine the average strain of this cycle is here, of that cycle is there, of that cycle is there. This you will see it also as drifting of the fatigue cycles, of the high hysteresis loop cycles. There are materials that are not viscoelastic, and so cycles that are all around. So the cycle for the next, and the cycle for the next, and the cycle for the next. And what I draw here is so sorry, they should go up to the same stress, but they're like that. What I saw here, there is a drop of the stiffness. So here is the stiffness drop during load because of damage, but there is no viscoelastic effect. There is no drift. So all the cycles are around the same average value. In our case, we see that we have quite significant strain evolution with the loading, and this signifies that our material, and this is what we see also in this graph here, signifies that our material shows quite significant viscoelastic performance. You see here, oh, I don't know, it doesn't. Okay, this video does not work. Here is the thermal behavior. If you remember, we said that we have used a photography with a backlight. These are the gray photos that you see here, and we use also the thermal camera that gives directly a measure of the surface temperature of the specimen. And you see that these two are correlated well. So the damage that we can observe in the specimen is when the specimen becomes darker. These are cracks that are evolving in the specimen bulk. And at the same time, we can observe that at the location of this concentrated damage, we have increase of temperature, which is the result of the increased friction that we have in this location. And of course, at the end, when we go to failure, the temperature goes quite high. And you see what is the limit, why we said that we keep, we can confine, if you like, the frequency of the specimens, because they are, in our case, the specimen failed. Although we started the test at around 20 degrees, the specimen failed with a local temperature at this point around 40 something degrees. But then if you go back to the DMA result for this material, the thermal analysis of the material, we see that 50 degrees is still in the region, 50 degrees, we are somewhere here, it's still in the glassy region of the material. So for us, this is an acceptable failure. If we would observe failures and measuring temperature there that were 80 degrees, for example, we would say that the material is already deteriorated or becoming softer because of the temperature increase. So then we can say that this test is not valid. The measurement of the temperature can be done continuously, as we saw in this diagram here. And of course, you can observe that for lower stress levels, we have lower temperature increase going up to 30, 35 degrees. And for the cases where we have very high stress levels, we can observe this temperature that reached around 45 degrees before final failure. So the observation of the failure at the end showed that we had mainly two fracture mechanisms that participated. The fiber breakage, which is the final failure, or the fiber pull-out. Fiber pull-out is when the fiber does not fail, but it goes out. So there is an interface failure between the fiber and the matrix. We did these observations with a very, very cheap digital handheld microscope. There's no necessary for this scale to use any expensive equipment. So the failure modes were different for different stress levels. And what is shown here is that for higher stress levels, what you see at the left on this figure A, photo A, we see that we had more fiber pull-out, and it was a bit of mix fiber pull-out and fiber breakage in intermediate stress levels, and it was more a fiber breakage at low stress levels. Coming back to the discussion that we had before and trying to explain this effect, we can say that at the high stress levels we have this fiber pull-out because of the if you can imagine, the excessive load was significant that pulled out the fibers directly. You remember here the fibers are not going from the, so we have the specimen in the machine loaded here, and the fibers are like that. So they are not continuous fiber from one loading point to the other. So at high loads, these fibers were teared out directly from the specimen with very local, very few damage in the bulk of the specimen. When we are at lower stress levels, we have significant damage everywhere in the matrix, and this led the fibers in the location to be weaker because they were not supported anymore by the matrix, and that's why we could see this local fiber failure. If I go back to these observations that show this photo that shows a comparison between the high stress level and the low stress level, we can see these effects. In high stress levels, we have a localized damage that led exactly to this fiber pull-out. In lower stress levels, we have a distributed damage. You don't see any significant damage concentration everywhere. The damage is spread in all around the specimen, and this is the reason that damage is accumulated there as matrix failures and causes at the end this failure mode.
Hello. Sir, I have one question.
Yes.
Sir, what are the effect you are seeing in thermal imaging? That is because the fibers are plus minus 45. Would we also see the similar behavior in UD composites?
Yes. You mean for the thermal?
Yeah.
For the increase of the temperature?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. You see it, but it's not so significant.
So, sir, does this effect because of the fiber aggression between them, the friction and all of the fibers?
The thermal increase is due to the friction between damaged surfaces. So you can imagine that in a unidirectional material, you don't have so much damage during the loading as what you have with the plus minus 45. You can also imagine that in a unidirectional material, your deformation is not so significant. So if you have reduced deformation, it means reduced friction, which means reduced temperature increases.
And sir, one more question regarding the experimental setup while you are using these fans. So are these fans to maintain the ambient temperature constant, or is it also taking the heat away from the specimen?
Yeah, exactly. It's the fans are not for maintaining. Okay, go back to the setup. Here you can see two fans. You have we have a very simple fan that you have on your desk, and you cannot see the other one, unfortunately, in this picture. Probably later on, there is a fan in the chamber of the machine itself. Probably it's this one over there.
Yes.
So this fan of the machine is there to keep the chamber temperature stable. The other fan that we have here is to cool down the specimen, so to send to the specimen air with a lower temperature.
But why do we want to do that? Why do we want to lower the temperature of a specimen?
Because you need to keep the frequency high as possible without heating the specimen. So this is the reason of putting the specimen also in the chamber. During the loading, you increase the temperature.
Yes.
If you let it without the chamber, it might be that the temperature at the end goes to 80 degrees. So your specimen fails, but fails not in an accepted way because it is softer. So to avoid this, you can do two things. Either you test at very low frequencies, so you have to test the specimen at 1 or 2 hertz, which takes ages at the end to finish your testing. Or
Okay.
as an alternative, you try to cool down the specimen somehow. And in this case, we found these methods with the chamber and the additional fan that seems to work quite well.
Okay. Because I was also trying similar experiment with the thermal imaging camera on UT Composites while doing the fatigue experiments, but I could not get the temperature rise. Like the temperature rise was around 2 to 3 degrees only there.
No, it's not.
It's,
I agree with you. It's not obvious. It's not easy to do this kind of test and keep temperatures at ranges that are reasonable and um, acceptable for justifying that the results are not falsified. Huh?
okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so I will go back to the up. Yes, here is a second photo of the specimens, again with the same microscope, the small microscope. And if you see here, actually, these are a compilation of photos. You see, there is one photo and another photo. There are some. Here is one photo. Here is another one. Here is another one. Because to keep the accuracy, we couldn't scan the entire specimen, so we scanned piece by piece, and then we just put the photos together. But what we see here in this slide anyway is the delamination that occurred in the resin between the layers. So these are layers, huh? One layer, second layer, third layer, and so on. We had in total 8 layers of material, and we see that during the loading you have a lot of delamination in different places of the material, and this delamination propagates. Even it's not only localized at the fracture region, but it is propagating to the specimen around the crack, around the damaged area. So you probably remember again, you see there is a lot of repetition of results, and it's a proof or validation of what we were discussing the previous days. We discussed about this reorientation of the fibers, and here we quantified this. And we've seen that in our case, we had more or less even up to 3-4 degrees of angle change with the loading. And especially, of course, you can imagine this angle increase or reorientation, as we call it, is more significant for higher loads, because then when you load at higher stresses, you actually apply more pressure to the material, and changes more. So at low stress levels, we've seen 1 or 2 degrees, and at high stress levels, we had up to 3-4 degrees of reorientation. And this is quite significant depending on the material, on the anisotropy of the material. And what we can see here in the stiffness, and what we expect for stiffness is a behavior like, for example, like these blue symbols that we have here at 58 degrees, 58 stress level. We see that we have a normal expected, normal is what is expected stiffness degradation is a trend that we know that for stiffness degradation we should have a trend like this. So this is perfectly correct for us. At higher stress levels, we've seen some peculiar behavior. This 64 is more or less okay, shows a very few stiffness degradation, but still at the same trend. But then if we go to 72 megapascal maximum cyclic stress, or 78 megapascal maximum cyclic stress, we see that we have even increase of the stiffness. And this is peculiar. You test the material, you damage the material, and it becomes stiffer. But this is explained exactly by this reorientation of the fibers. When the fibers orient in different become aligned with the specimen loading, then the specimen is stiffer than before. And that's why we can explain, this is how we can explain this increase here. And then we also compare the self-generated heating, which is quantified, if you like, with the area of these high hysteresis loops. And again, here we had similar performance as with the stiffness. The heating was, of course, as expected, lower at lower stress levels, and it was increasing as the stress level was increasing. Another part of the investigation was the investigation of the loading type. We did two different loads. Both of them are tensile, so we didn't go to compressive loading there to avoid any problems of buckling, and we didn't want to use any anti-buckling devices. And there we've seen that the scatter was more than at 0.5 compared to the 0.1. And this is probably related to the maximum to the, so if I plot here, oops. If I plot here and start also this discussion about the creep effect that we'll see later on. If this is 0.1 testing, stress over number of cycles, 0.5 for the same stress max. So to compare, for example, these two stress levels, for the same stress max, your sigma, your test for 0.5 might be something like that. Oops, my mouse does not follow. Could be something like this, which means for the same maximum stress, we have an average. So we have a continuous, if you like, stress on the specimen, which is higher than this. And this is related, can be attributed, this difference that we see can be attributed to the creep effects that prevail in this compared to in this loading case compared to the loading case or are equal to 0.1. So again, to the discussion that we had yesterday, here we see the fitting that we did here is a simple power law fitting with the confidence bounds defined by the ASTM 739, the typical fitting equations suggested by ASTM. So for the same testing, you remember we wanted to investigate the viscoelastic effect, so we did pure creep testing. And these are the results, typical results of creep for different stress levels. You apply a stress level here, and you keep it constant, and you measure the strain with time. And this is what we measure for higher stresses. Of course, you have more rapid strain increase. For lower, you have lower. So this is information that we kept for the next to correlate creep and fatigue in the same experimental procedure. We also took some photos during the creep testing to investigate also the damage evolution in creep. And again, we've seen that there is damage in creep, but it starts or it is correlated mainly to the condition of the end of the creep test, which is probably you know about this creep description. We call it the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary part of creep. And usually in the literature, people say that the first two regions are regions where the material deforms, but it is any damage or any deformation is recoverable, and damage is created to the material only at the end of the creep. In our case, we've seen some matrix cracks already in the beginning, and the main damage that led to failure is really attributed to the final stages of the creep. So talking about creep, then we realize this creep fatigue testing with the same constant amplitude, keeping at high stresses and so on until failure. And here I have it with dashed lines because in some cases, and this depends on many parameters, depending on this stress level, depending on the time that we kept under load. So these 2 hours or 48 hours. In some cases, we had failure during the fatigue loading. In some other cases, we had failure during the creep loading. So the results are shown here. You see also the strain evolution. This is the strain evolution during fatigue, and this is the strain evolution during creep, resembling the creep test that we had before. And then continuously changing this, again fatigue, and then again creep, and so on. You see here an effect that we discussed yesterday. Now you remember we said that when the material is left unloaded or even loaded, it restarts the testing at a lower strain. And this is exactly what we've seen here. Even for creep, we had cases, especially when creep was at 2 hours and not 48 hours, we had cases that the strain of the specimen, when we were resuming the fatigue testing, was lower than before. So this is the evolution of the strain up to the final failure of the material. So comparing these 3 SN curves, you see now we have 3 SN curves, all made by different ways of testing. One is the SN curve, the black here is the typical SN curve that we've seen before. The blue one is the SN curve when we interrupted the test for a creep at 2 hours. And the red one is the SN curve when we interrupted the creep at 48 hours. And it is very interesting to compare these curves and see exactly the effect of creep at high stress levels and low stress levels. If I focus on the high stress levels, here we see that creep for a few hours, 2 hours, so the blue line is beneficial. It gives better fatigue performance than the normal specimens that are continuously loaded up to failure. When we let creep for more, it gives the opposite effect. It turns the curve turns to the left, and this is exactly related to what we discussed before. Initial creep for few hours, which means I'm trying to explain this simply. You remember the discussion that we had yesterday, how we can delay the crack. Now we have in the specimen a lot of multiple of these cracks here and there. When we apply some load for 2 hours, we create plastic zones in the crack tip. And these plastic zones are beneficial, you see, this behavior. When we let it for more, then we go to the last parts of the creep curve, and we create damage, significant damage due to creep. And this is the reason that here we go to the other side. So these effects are more or less justified by these observations, and it's quite significant to show that here, for example, we say, okay, it's not very different, but if you see the average numbers of cycles here for imagine at this 70 megapascal of stress, if we get the line for the average for the black curve here is around 700 cycles, and the blue curve gives around 2000 cycles. So it's more than twice as much life that you can secure if you apply a creep load for a certain small, short time interval. If you keep this creep for longer times, then you can go down to half of your fatigue life at these high stress levels. So let me open everything here. Oops, open everything here to discuss again. Stiffness degradation. You remember we expect something monotonically. We expect a behavior with a monotonically decreasing trend, but here, because of the interruptions, we see that the creep was recovering and then starting again to drop. The same for different. So this is for high stress levels. The same for lower stress levels. We have a. I'm discussing here, for example, the blue curve. We have a stiffness that drops, and then while we interrupt, the stiffness recovers and goes back, and so on until the failure. And the same behavior happens with the high hysteresis loop areas. So if we compare now the two cases of 48 hours and 2 hours of creep, we see that the damage in the case of 2 hours of creep is more because of the damage during the loading, so the fatigue damage, and creep contributes only at the end. And when we go to 48 hours, we see that creep is more dominant for the material performance, and in some cases, this is the cases where we mentioned before that the material fails even under creep loads and not under fatigue loads at the end. So in the cases where we left the material to creep only for 2 hours, we mainly observe fatigue failure. In the cases where we left the material to creep for 48 hours, in some cases, especially at high stress levels, we were observing creep failure. The same is the same comparison for a different material at low stress levels, where again, here in low stress levels, because the creep was not significant, the stress for creep was not significant, and it was necessitating very, very long times for failure. In both cases, we observed fatigue failures. And again, discussing very briefly the failure modes, photos taken with the same handheld microscope, we can see similar behavior to the behavior that we observed before with fiber pull-out and fiber breakage, especially the combination or the dominant fiber breakage comes to the specimens that are loaded at lower stress levels, exactly as we've seen before. And when we are at high stress levels, we mainly have fiber pull-out. So probably we can, now that we'll talk about interrupted fatigue, using the same joke that we did yesterday, we can interrupt a bit for this first hour to take a break and resume in 5-10 minutes. What Professor Bedi, if you are still. We
yes,
make
we can
break
break for 5 minutes. Participants